this talk isn't going to be about the politics of this country. We are going to consider Jerusalem, but I just thought I'd show you a couple of verses from the Bible just in the context of an election coming up tomorrow. And here's a couple of verses that I think are worth us thinking about over the next few days. And the first one is taken from the prophet Daniel. So it's a book in the Old Testament. And in Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, very simple words that, we can understand. It says, "The Most High," which is talking about God, "rules over the kingdoms of the world." And by the way, that includes Britain, because we are a kingdom in this world, are we not? "And he gives them to anyone he chooses." So in other words, it's God who puts in place the people who rule the countries of this world. And that's quite a remarkable thing for the Bible to say is happening, but God does do that. That's what we believe. And in fact, it's not only the Old Testament that says that. Have a quick look at this. This is in Romans chapter 13, and it's verse 1. It's taken from a more modern translation, this one, but even in older versions it says the same thing. It says, "Everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God." Now, that is quite interesting, because if you stop and think about it, if that's true, it means all the world leaders that we see have, for some reason, good or evil, been put there for some purpose by God, including people that we might wonder how on earth that did happen. We have to sort of pinch ourselves slightly, don't we, at the moment, with what Mr. Trump's doing. But all of these things are building up for the conclusion of God's plan and purpose in this earth. So that's all I'm going to say about the election. Go and have maybe a look at those verses at some time. Are we going to get these slides? We can get these slides out, can't we? And if anybody's interested. So, but tonight we're going to look at Jerusalem. That's the main focus of this evening. I think it's fair to say there is no other city on earth quite like Jerusalem, is there? When you think about it, the major three faiths on planet Earth all have a stake in this city. To the Jewish people, it is absolutely central to their own religion. It's where the Temple of Solomon was built. It's their capital city, but from a religious point of view, it's right there in the very centre of their faith, where they went to worship and where they still go to worship at the Wailing Wall. It's the very central part of their own religion. And of course, from a Christianity point of view, Jerusalem's also really special and significant, because that is where the Lord Jesus Christ was crucified, for one. It's exactly where the very first Christian church was established. It was right there in Jerusalem. Christianity began in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's also a very special place for many, many Christians. And of course, not only that, but we've also got the Muslims as well. It's their third most holy place. It is apparently where Muhammad went off to heaven on a horse, and he went up to heaven on a horse from Jerusalem. So they also are very interested from a religious point of view in Jerusalem. Now you tell me another city where that happens, where all the world's religions have got something to say about this particular city on earth. And in fact, here is a map, of Jerusalem. It looks a bit messy, but effectively that is the whole of the city of Jerusalem there, at least the old city of Jerusalem. And, well, you can see, I don't know whether you can see actually, but it's split into quarters. They're called quarters. So you've got here the Christian quarter. This orange bit here is the Muslim quarter. This bit here is the Jewish quarter. This bit here is called the Armenian quarter. And the United Nations looks at that quarter as being Palestinian. They see a link between the Armenian quarter and the Palestinians. But which other capital city is split up like that? It's quite amazing, isn't it, really, that all of them have got their own quarter. They've all got something to say. But it doesn't actually end there, because not only have you got all these religious elements, and bearing in mind, of course, we're talking about billions of people. This isn't just a few radical people who say Jerusalem, we're interested in it. There's 1 billion Christians. There's 1 billion Muslims. It's a huge percentage of the world's population that's got something to say about this. But even more than that, we've got this situation. Because not only is Jerusalem seen as a religious centre, it's also a political centre as well. Because, of course, there are two people who say, actually, excuse me, Jerusalem is our capital. So on the one hand, and these are headlines, by the way, from only in the last 4 weeks. But to be fair, it doesn't matter when I do this talk, these are headlines that come through time and time and time again. But because of Mr. Trump's involvement by flying out to Israel only a few weeks ago, they started coming out with their own statements to say, hold on a minute. So there is the leader of the Palestinians, Abbas, and he said East Jerusalem should be the Palestinian capital. Meanwhile, Netanyahu, who is the Prime Minister of Israel, vows that Israel will continue to build in our capital, Jerusalem. So now we've got two different sets of people, both saying Jerusalem is our capital. Can you imagine this in London or any other capital city, that you've got two sets of people saying it's ours, no it's mine, yes, no it's ours, and then all the religions are saying it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. You can see why over the years there's been a lot of conflict over this particular city, and so there has. Now we've asked you here this evening actually for a sort of a special reason, and it's because of the anniversary of this particular day on the calendar. And apparently, because I wasn't alive at the time, but 50 years ago, exactly today, is when Israel, there was a big war that happened called the 6-Day War, and we're going to look at this. There was a war that lasted in Israel and its surrounding neighbours, and it lasted for 6 days. And during those 6 days, Israel, the Jewish people, took Jerusalem and made it their united capital. And that actually is quite significant. And the reason it's significant is because of things that God tells us in the Bible. And so what we want to do this evening is show you some of the significance of this city. And we're going to look in the Bible, and we're going to see what the Bible says about Jerusalem. And we're going to see why it was that 50 years ago, very, very significant prophecies were fulfilled, which leads us into a chain of prophecies that are continuing to be fulfilled, which culminate, and this is the big exciting bit, it culminates in the return of Jesus back to this earth, to establish a worldwide kingdom where he will actually rule from Jerusalem. And the events in 1967, 50 years ago, were part of that particular story. Now, what we're going to do is, we're not going to really turn to any other book. In fact, I tell a lie, because there's a couple of quotes, as you'll see later, from some of the books, but 99% of what we're going to quote this evening is from this book, the Bible. The Bible is just an astounding book. You know, so lots of you in here, I know, read the Bible. Some of you might not have read it before. I would urge you to pick this book up. It is absolutely, completely unique. The word Bible just means book. And the word holy, Holy Bible, the word holy means something that's separate. This is a separate book. And you know something? You could get all the books in the world and pop the Bible there, and all the other books would have to be put over here. The reason it's separate from all of the books is that it's the only book to be inspired by God himself, and God it is that has said, right, these are my words, I want you different people to write it down. It was written over such a long period of time, at least 1,500 years, by around 40 different people, and yet, I mean, how do you write a book over 1,500 years with all different people speaking different languages, some of them, some kings, some shepherds, some clearly didn't know the other person that had written a book that was very similar, and all of it's pulled together, and it all makes sense. There's no editing of the Bible. There isn't revision 1, revision 2, revision 3, revision 5028. It's exactly the same. And yeah, it's translated into English and translated into German and all the rest of it, but actually when all is said and done, we are all reading the same words. Just have a little look at this. We might, I don't know who's on the volume here, but I don't quite know how loud it's going to come through, but let's see how we get on.
Interesting facts about the Bible. The Bible is comprised of 66 books, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. The Bible was written by over 40 different authors and was written over a period of 1,600 years. Job is considered to be the oldest in the Bible, while the book of Revelation is the youngest, written in 95 AD. The longest book in the Bible is the book of Psalms. The shortest is 2 John, with only 13 verses in the entire book. The Bible has been translated into roughly 2,018 different languages and is the world's best-selling book.
There you go. I pretty much said all of that. We needn't have played that, but it's a test on the volume. We could probably tweak it up a little bit for the next clip. Now, here's the interesting thing, because, why not? Here's the interesting thing. The word Jerusalem itself is mentioned over 700 times in the Bible. This is a great place to go, isn't it, if we want to find out more about what God says about this city, Jerusalem, over 700 times. And by the way, and you might know this, I don't know, but the Quran, which is another holy book, as some people will say it is, Jerusalem isn't mentioned a single solitary time, not by the Arab name of Quds or by the word Jerusalem at all. So it's not mentioned, so we can't go there. We need to go to the Bible. It's mentioned over 700 times. It's a really key city in the Bible. Now, as I've said to you, we're at the 50th anniversary of big events that happened back... Who was here in 1967? I mean, you guys, there's a few of you that weren't. See, some of you might even remember this, So I was born in 69, so I missed all the excitement. But I was talking to my parents. They actually got married just a month after this war took place. And they actually said, we remember there was tremendous excitement amongst Christadelphians because they could see back then that prophecy was being fulfilled before their eyes. Did some of you feel that who were here? And a huge amount of excitement, and there was. Now, for those of you who weren't there, or maybe you haven't looked at it too much, I found a little bit of video, and it's got some it's a little bit of cartoon to start with, but it's actually got some live clips from back then, just to show you what was going on. So we're winding the clock back now to 1967, 50 years ago tonight, what was happening in the world back then. So let's just have a little look at this.
On the 15th of May 1967, on Israel's Independence Day, a 3-week period began, which was one of the most tense and fearful periods in Israel's history. In direct contravention of international agreements, Egyptian leader Jamal Abdel Nasser removed the UN peacekeeping forces and began moving tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks into what was the demilitarized Sinai Peninsula towards Israel's southern border. Egypt also blockaded the Straits of Tiran, an open international waterway which was essentially a declaration of war. Israel turned to the nations of the world, primarily to the United States, for assistance against Egyptian aggression, but somehow all Western countries decided to remain neutral. Israel, with 2.5 million Jews, was left alone to face the might of the Arab nations. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon formed a military alliance and began moving forces into Jordan towards Israel's borders. When the Arab countries realized that the world had abandoned Israel, many other Muslim countries were openly calling for the destruction of Israel. The will and means to murder millions of Jews were evident.
A biblical prophecy comes to pass as the forces of Israel sweep on in an astonishing triumph of strategy. After achieving air supremacy, her forces thrust like an avenging sword at the very heart of Arab self-confidence.
And then, perhaps, the greatest miracle of all, a miracle Israel never expected: Jerusalem. Again, it seemed as though it was a divine appointment in time. Jerusalem was to be restored to the Jewish people after 2,000 years. Yitzhak Rabin, then the Minister of Defense, was given the honor of giving the war its name. He chose the Six-Day War, recalling the 6 days of creation, as Israel too was created with the liberation of Jerusalem.
So these are amazing things. So in 1948, Israel was created, and we'll look a bit more at that in a minute. But in 1948, Israel did not have all of Jerusalem. It only had a small part of it, and it only had roughly half the land that they now have. And what that little news clip was saying was, there was this tension that built up from 1948 up to 1967, and in 1967, Israel was sat there and there were all these noises about war, as you just saw, and Israel launched a preemptive attack upon Egypt, and suddenly all the other Arab nations joined in. There was this mighty war that only lasted for 6 days, and during those 6 days, and in fact on this very day, 50 years ago, they took the whole city of Jerusalem. And you might say to me, well, so what? You know, it's a long way off. I live in the UK. This is 50 years ago. Do I really care? Well, I don't know whether you noticed in that clip, it came up saying something like the British News Organisation or something like that. And this is like the BBC News back then, and this is exactly word for word what the reporter said. He said, a biblical prophecy comes to pass as the forces of Israel sweep on in an astonishing triumph of strategy. Well, well, well. You're watching your news back then, and the BBC reporter says a biblical prophecy comes to pass as the forces of Israel sweep on in an astonishing triumph of strategy. What is he referring to? Why did he say a prophecy, a biblical prophecy, comes to pass? This isn't, you might be a Christian person, I don't know, but that's exactly what he said on the newsreel from back then. And we're going to look at what the prophecy is that I think he was referring to. And we're going to go all the way back to AD 33, give or take. And we're going to join the Lord Jesus Christ right next to Jerusalem. And we're going to go back in time, and we're going to pretend that we're standing with him and his disciples. And there he is, and there's his disciples. And I tell you where he is, right there. He is stood on the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is really close to Jerusalem. And in fact, there is Jerusalem over here, and this is the great temple that they're looking at as they're looking down from the Mount of Olives upon this huge, wondrous temple that existed when Jesus lived. And while they were there, they were talking. Jesus was talking to his disciples, and the disciples were listening to him. And we're going to now join them in the conversation that they were having at this very point in time. And it's recorded for us, word for word, in Luke chapter 21, verses 5 to 7. If any of you want to look this chapter up, you can, but the words are here on the screen. So this is Luke chapter 21. They're sat on the Mount of Olives. We're with them. We're listening in. some of his disciples, some of Jesus' disciples, began talking about the majestic stonework of the temple and the memorial decorations on the walls. But Jesus said, "The time is coming when all these things will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." "Teacher," they asked, "when will all this happen?" Now, just going back to that previous slide, you can see from the Mount of Olives, you can see what they were looking at, and they're going, wow, look at all this amazing building in front of us, how the stones are adorned, and look at the temple. And that's what we've just read. And Jesus suddenly says out the blue, hold on, it's all going to get demolished. Not one stone will be left upon another. This is some amazing building as well. This is a sort of an artist's impression of what the temple probably did look like in those days. It was an enormous structure, beautiful, gold inside, you name it, gold on the outside. It was a fantastic place. And of course, even today, there's the remnants of the retaining wall of Jerusalem, of the temple, sorry, that is still there. And the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, is the retaining wall that was there at the very time that Jesus was talking to his disciples. Those stones there were exactly the same stones that were still there, one on top of another, when Jesus was saying those words. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? 2,000 years later, they're still there. That's why the Jews go to this wall. It's very special. It's their connection back for a long, long time. So what did the disciples say? They said, well, Jesus, when's that going to happen? When is this enormous temple going to come down? And in verse 20 of Luke chapter 21, Jesus says, I'll tell you. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that the time of its destruction has arrived. And you know something? This was in AD 33. Just shortly after that, of course, Jesus was crucified. And very shortly after that, he ascended to be with his Father in heaven. But in AD 70, so how many years later is that? Is that 37 years? I'm trying to do the maths here. Let's say 37 years later. 37 years later, in AD 70, that Jerusalem was surrounded by armies, and the Romans came, and this is what happened. Now I'm going to show you another video. Now this was not video that somebody took in AD 70. There were no cameras back then. However, the audio that you're going to listen to is taken directly not from the Bible, but from ancient historians that lived about that time. Not Christians, ancient historians, one of which is Josephus. But just have a little watch of this.
After a 4-month siege, Rome's legions finally broke through the first wall of the city. The zealots rushed to meet them and fought with tremendous bravery. But they could not prevent the Romans from fighting their way to the heart of the city, the temple.
The Romans proceeded as far as the Holy House itself. Then one of them set fire to it. Now the Jews suffered nothing to restrain their force, nor tried to save their lives, since their holy house was perishing.
The temple, the only place on earth, according to the Bible, where God could be worshipped, was laid to waste by the Romans.
As for a great part of the people, they were weak and without arms, and had their throats cut wherever they were caught. In the temple around the altar lay dead bodies heaped one upon another, and at the steps going up to it ran a great quantity of their blood. In the history of the world, no nation has ever suffered such a calamity.
The destruction of the temple in the year 70 was the greatest catastrophe and trauma to happen to the Jewish people, I would argue, until our own time in the Holocaust.
So that's quite amazing, isn't it? Because there was Jesus in AD 33 saying this great temple that you see is going to get completely demolished. And roughly 40 years after that, and you can, this, you know, the historians will tell you this, Encyclopedia Britannica will tell you this, it all did get demolished. The whole lot of it got demolished. And so let's carry on in Luke 21. We're just staying with this script now. We're staying with this conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples, because all of it is hugely significant. So here we're back in Luke 21. We're in verse 24. We're still in the same chapter, in the same discourse at the same time. Jesus continues to say that they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. So we'll just stop there just for a minute. Somebody tell me, who is the they, do you think, that are going to fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive? Which people is it talking about? The Jews, exactly. So Jesus is saying they, the Jews, not only is the temple going to be demolished, but they, the Jews, are going to fall by the edge of the sword. Did you see what was happening there? That the throats cut, thousands, tens of thousands were killed in Jerusalem, and that clearly happened. And there was this great war that the Jews had no chance of winning, because Rome came against them and set fire to the place, and as we've just said, destroyed it. But what Jesus then says is that the Jews will be led away captive into all nations. In other words, Israel as a nation that existed at AD 70 is going to come to an end. If somebody comes into this country and takes us all off captive into different nations, there's not a lot left of the UK. And that's exactly what happened with Israel. The Roman armies came in and, you know, did lead them captive into all nations. And I'm going to show you a chart here. This is from a book from Martin Gilbert. Martin Gilbert's an interesting fella. I don't know if he's a Christian either, but he's plotted over time the history of the Jews. And this is one particular map. It's going back a few years now. It's back in 1991. But can you see all those nations? And next to each nation there's a number. And that was the number back then in 1991 of the number of Jews that are living in that nation. Now that is quite amazing when you consider that they're a very tiny people. There are not a billion Jews. In fact, there's somewhere in the region of 15 million Jews in the world. That's it. It's a tiny number of people. But look at how they're spread into all nations. Jesus said, you lose your city, and actually the temple will be destroyed, and you'll be scattered into all nations. So really, we've seen that happen over the millennia, that this is exactly what has happened. What else do we read? So just going back to the start, we're still in the same verse. Look, they shall fall by the edge of the sword, that's the Jews will be killed, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And then we get this interesting phrase, because Jesus then says that Jerusalem, this city that we're considering tonight, shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. Now, a Gentile is an interesting word. It's basically anybody that is not a Jew is, in Bible terms, a Gentile. So we're well, you might be a Jew, I don't know. But generally speaking, in the UK, we're all Gentiles because we're not Jews. And so anybody that is not a Jew is a Gentile. So what Jesus is saying here, look, Jerusalem is going to get trodden down. We might put in modern language, occupied. Jerusalem is going to be occupied by non-Jewish people. So you've lost your city, you're scattered into all nations, and non-Jewish people are going to control Jerusalem. Am I reading too much into that? That's what it says. But here's the multi-million-pound wonder of it all. Because Jesus carries on. He doesn't stop there. He uses this amazing, tiny, insignificant little word, until. And by putting in that word until, means that one day Jerusalem will not be trodden down by the Gentiles, because look what he says. Jerusalem is going to be trodden down by non-Jewish people. It's going to be occupied by non-Jewish people until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, what does he mean by that? He's clearly saying that one day in the distant future, he doesn't say the distant future, but we now know it is, one day in the distant future, the Gentiles will not be treading down Jerusalem. They will not be occupying Jerusalem, because clearly the Jews will be. Can we infer that from that, do you think? Jerusalem will be trodden down by non-Jewish people until the time of the Gentiles is up, is finished. Now, this is quite amazing, because we've already said that Jerusalem was actually taken away from the Jews in exactly AD 70. That's when it happened. And 1,897 years later, 50 years ago today, the Jews, for the first time in all of that time, suddenly have control, sovereign control, which they have over the city again. Now that's quite amazing that that has happened. This makes 1967 a very significant point in time, and why it was even back then that Christadelphians were super excited that these things were taking place. Now you might say, well, we're looking here at Luke 21, but if it's such a big deal, surely there'd be lots of other places in the Bible that talk about the Jews coming back to the land again. Well, you would be right, and there are. And in the Old Testament, there are lots and lots and lots of passages that talk about the Jews being scattered and the Jews being regathered in the last days. So here's a few of them. So in Deuteronomy chapter 28, quite early on in the Bible, this talks about the scattering, not the regathering, this particular one, but have a look at this all the same. The Lord shall scatter you, Jewish people, among all people, from the one end of the earth even to the other. And there you're going to serve other gods that neither you or your fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations you'll find no ease, neither thy sole of thy foot will have rest, but the Lord shall give you there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind. And you've only got to look to see how the Jews have got on in countries around this world over the last 2,000 years. And do you think they've had a great time? No. They've been severely persecuted wherever they have gone. In Jeremiah 31 verse 10, we read these words, "Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare it in the coastlands far away, and say, He who scattered Israel will gather him, and will keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock." So yes, says God, I've scattered you, but I'm going to gather you again. But where's he going to gather them? Well, look at this one. Ezekiel chapter 11 verse 17. "Therefore say, Thus saith the Lord God, I will gather you from the peoples," that means the nations of the world, "and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and lo and behold, I will give you the land of Israel." This is in the Old Testament. God says, I'm going to scatter you, I'm going to regather you back to the land of Israel. In Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 34, "I will bring you out from the people, and I will gather you out of the countries wherein you are scattered, with a mighty hand, and with a stretched out arm, and with fury poured out." In Ezekiel 34, verse 13, "I will bring them out from the people, and gather them from the countries, and will bring them to their own land, and feed them upon the mountains of Israel by the rivers, and in all the inhabited places of the country." And all of those are absolute plain English that a 10-year-old could understand in terms of what it's saying, I'm absolutely certain. But it's also in the Bible in symbolic terms as well. We might need to turn the sound up on this particular one because the audio is a little bit quiet. But this is a little video about what the Bible calls the Valley of Dry Bones. And it's a little symbolic prophecy about Israel coming back to the land.
the hand of the Lord came upon me, and brought me out in the spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. And he said to me, Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, I will put sinews on you, and bring flesh upon you, cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived and stood upon their feet, an exceedingly great army. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, O my people, I will place you in your own land, and then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and performed it.
Look, the Bible is super clear that the Jews were going to be scattered and brought back to the land. And you might say, well, if that's the case, surely every person who's been reading the Bible over all these years would have been saying, hold on, God's going to bring Israel back to the land. It's clear, it says it, but was anybody saying it before 1948? And you know what? Some people who read their Bibles most definitely did. Here's one person who did. Sir Isaac Newton, who lived 1642 to 1727. He is the father of science, according to most encyclopedias that you read. You know, he is the one who discovered gravity and the formulas of calculus, and most of the science that he discovered back then is what we now still build on. None of it has ever been disproved. He was an amazingly intelligent man, this man, Isaac Newton. Mathematician, physicist, astronomer, amazing guy. And do you know something? He wrote more about God and more about the Bible than he wrote on any other subject. And yet, do you know what the world did? They latched onto his science and threw the whole lot about his religious beliefs in the bin in its entirety. It's not in the bin. Much of it is in Jerusalem, of all places. And this man looked at the stars and studied the way that they moved and came to the conclusion that this is his words. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things. He was an atheist to start with, but ended up totally and utterly convinced that there must be an intelligent being. But on more than that, Isaac Newton wrote pages and pages about prophecy. And one of the books he wrote was Observations and Prophecies from Daniel and the Apocalypse. And in there, Isaac Newton wrote, it may perhaps come forth not from the Jews themselves, but from some other kingdom friendly to them, and precede their return from captivity and give occasion to it. In other words, I think there could be a friendly country that helps the Jews come back to their land. Lo and behold, we were that friendly country, believe it or not. That's another subject. The return from captivity, he writes, and the coming of the Messiah and his kingdom are described in Daniel, Revelation, Acts, Matthew, Joel, and so he goes on. This man knows what he's talking about, very intelligent, and also very wise, because he believed in God. Here's another chap. This is Thomas Brightman, wrote in 1615. Shall the Jews, that's who he's talking about, shall they return to Jerusalem again? There is nothing more certain. The prophets do everywhere confirm it and beat upon it. In other words, they don't let go of this. They keep on and on and on and on and on about it. They're going to come back to the land. And here, in 1948, is what it looked like.
October 1947. 2 shiploads of Jewish refugees from Europe attempt to land in Palestine, only to be turned away by the British and shipped to internment on Cyprus. The British mandate in Palestine was about to end, however, and the United Nations was debating the partition of Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs as a solution to the turmoil in that country. In In May of 1948, a new Jewish state, Israel, was born in a bath of blood. Jewish troops routed Arab forces from the city of Haifa in the first of a series of battles that were to reverberate through the years. Meanwhile, on May 14th, 1948, the new government headed by David Ben-Gurion is installed in Tel Aviv. Thus, for the first time since the Roman legion destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 A.D., the Jewish people have a nation of their own.
And they did in 1948 have a nation of their own, but guess what it looked like? You see on the right here, that light blue shape, this wiggly shape down here, that was the land that they were given in 1948. Did you hear it said about the UN partition? They were not given what we now call the West Bank, and they only had half of Jerusalem. But in the Six-Day War, okay, so roughly 20 years after Israel was created in 48, Israel took hold of the West Bank, took hold of Jerusalem in its entirety, and that is the current shape of modern Israel. Now, this is the exact shape of ancient Israel. So if you go back to the ancient times when the prophets were writing, like Ezekiel and so on, back in the days of Solomon or David, this is the shape of Israel. Now, do you notice something pretty similar? It's like the same. When God said, I will regather you and give you the land, God doesn't say, well, look, I tell you what, I'll give you about 90%. I'll give you some of it. I'll give you a little bit of it. When God says, I'll give you the land, in Deuteronomy, it details out exactly where the land is and the borders and so on. So this is quite amazing that this has 2,000 years later happened. Now, Jerusalem in 1948 was split, not down the middle, but this is the little bit of Jerusalem that Israel had, only a tiny bit of it, but this is the whole of Jerusalem. And in 1948, this is from Wikipedia, in 1948, Jerusalem, it says, was divided into a western part under Israeli rule and an eastern part under Jordanian rule. In 1967, Six-Day War, 50 years ago today, the Labour government, headed by whatever his name is, Eshkol, set the guidelines to attain complete Israeli sovereignty over a united Jerusalem. And on June the 28th, 1967, the Knesset amended the law of 1950, which proclaimed Jerusalem as Israel's capital to reflect the newly defined municipal boundaries. Therefore, for the first time, Israeli law extended to cover all parts of Jerusalem. So really, the big significant date isn't actually today. It's in about a week or two's time. It's on the 28th of June. And this is the day when Israel signed into law that we now have sovereign control of the city. That's pretty amazing. But here we are 50 years later, and you might scratch your head and think, well, where does this... what? What's going on? Jesus said they were going to come back. What does he say next? I think that's a good question, isn't it? Because we're 50 years on. Let's go back. Let's join them on this Mount of Olives. Does Jesus say anything else? Do you know what his next words are? Here they are. Very next words. And this has to be after 1967, by the way, because he's just said that the Jews are going to have control of Jerusalem again. That happened in 67. And then he continues exactly like this. And there'll be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars. And upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Does that ring any sort of bell with anybody in the room? Does this, what have we got here? Signs in the sun, moon and stars. We've got nations in distress. Perplexity is saying, I don't know the answer. I can't solve the problem. There's sea and waves roaring. There's men's hearts failing them for fear when they look on the news, when they look on the TV, when they open the newspaper, when they listen to the radio, their hearts are failing them for fear. They don't like what they see. They're fearful. And here we are at the end of this period of time, 50 years, and I think this is quite a good description, don't you? Do you think we live in a world of fear and terror? Because, by the way, that's what the Greek word for fear means. It is terror. In fact, the White House spokesman said not long ago, this is how it is in the age of terror. He says we live in the age of terror. Do we see signs in the heavens? Well, we'll have a look at that in just a second. Do we see a world not able to sort its problems out, do you think? Perplexed as to... Look at Theresa May's face. They don't know how to cope with the terrorism that we see. That's only one small part of the problems. I think the answer has got to be a resounding yes, more than ever before. I'm just going to play you a few little clips now. These events that you're about to see all happened in March this year. I could spend all night showing you astounding things, but let's just think about the signs in the sun, moon and stars and in the heavens, and this is all happening only a few months ago in March.
Tonight, across central Texas, many are asking, did you see it? That fire in the sky that some say caused a sonic boom.
We could show you amazing things happening in the heavens, on earth, in terms of signs, but there's just a few things. That's all in just a few weeks and just a few months ago. What about the fear on earth? Well, here's a clip taken from a review by CNN of 2015, and this is their little summary of what the world is going through at the moment.
Breaking news, masked men opened fire at the offices of a controversial newspaper in Paris.
Two armed men entered the building and began opening fire.
There's been a hostage taking at a kosher deli. Meanwhile, those two brothers suspected of the attack are holed up and cornered.
Terrorists who traumatized this region for 3 days are dead, but not before leaving 17 innocent lives ended.
Major new offensive launched by ISIS. The U.S.-led coalition is striking back. Are we winning right now?
We're still building the forces. I'm confident we will win.
The Russian passenger plane with 224 people on board crashes in Egypt.
ISIS claimed it had brought down the plane. Vladimir Putin is vowing to take revenge.
Devastating earthquake in Nepal.
This is the race against time. Brick by brick, the desperate dig to find survivors.
A growing crisis overseas. Migrants trying to escape their war-torn homelands attempting to get to Europe.
President Obama is strongly defending that controversial deal to halt Iran's nuclear program.
It is a good deal.
You guys have been bamboozled, and the American people are going to pay for that.
Bamboozled, outmaneuvered, outnegotiated. Were you fleeced?
There's a lot of politics going on there.
Breaking news. This comes out of France, where a German-winged passenger plane has crashed.
Disturbing new detail, the co-pilot intentionally crashed the plane into the mountains.
The terror group ISIS claims responsibility for unprecedented attacks in Paris in 6 separate but coordinated bombings and shootings.
The scene of the worst carnage at the Bataclan Theater.
Witnesses say they saw these shooters arrive inside and begin firing indiscriminately.
An international manhunt is now underway.
Police carried out a deadly raid. The suspected ringleader is in fact dead. The soul of the city is intact. They have heavy hearts, but they are not going to succumb to fear.
It seems another week, another tragic mass shooting.
9 people killed in an unthinkable crime in Charleston, South Carolina. What does it say about us that in 2015 somebody walks into a church and then shoots them one by one?
It's an unbelievable situation that we're in, and of course it's getting ever closer to home. Jesus said it'd be a time of fear in this world. We are in it, I think, as we speak. He also said that we would see the sea and the waves roaring, and most certainly in the last few years we have. So it's building up to something at the end of this 50-year period, is it not? That's what Jesus said. This is what you're going to see. But he doesn't end there. The next verse says, "And then the people who see these things happening, they shall see the Son of Man, Jesus himself, coming in a cloud with power and great glory." Wow. All of these things are going to culminate in the return of Jesus. When these things begin to come to pass, look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws near. When it says that Jesus is going to come in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, believe me when it says that, because that's exactly what's going to happen. We will see Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And guess where he's coming back to? We're told in Zechariah 14 verse 2 that he's going to come back to Jerusalem and sort the whole thing out. Because one of the things that's going to happen at the very end, this tribulation and time of fear, is going to escalate and continue to grow to the point when, this is what we read. So here we are in Zechariah 14 verse 2. "I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle." Never has there been a time in any of history where all nations are being gathered against Jerusalem to battle. It will come. The city will be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, half the city will go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So there's a great conflagration coming soon over Jerusalem. And it's going to look a very horrific situation where Jerusalem, just like back in AD 70, is going to come under a terrible war. But in Zechariah 14, it continues to say that his feet, and you'll have to check this out, but these are the feet of the Lord Jesus Christ, his feet will stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, the very place where Jesus told the prophecy that we've been looking at tonight. He comes back to the very mountain when he said all these things, and his feet will stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, and so he's literally going to descend from heaven, because that's where he is at the minute. He's coming back right here. And it goes on and says in the same chapter, and this was the last verse that Ian read for us, he read that the Lord shall be king over all the earth, and in that day there shall be one Lord, and his name one. There shall be no more utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. Well. Jerusalem, you know, means the city of peace. And throughout all of its long history, it's never been a city of peace. It's always been in conflict and always been at war. And there'll be a final, great, enormous war at the end of this time of trouble that we're in right now, when God himself says to his son, "Son, I want you to go back to the world, and I want you to go back to the Mount of Olives where you gave that prophecy that concluded everything, and I want you to go and sort it out. And I want you to take over the world, and I want you to set up a righteous government, and I want all things to be sorted out, and Jerusalem finally will become the city that it was always supposed to be, which was a city of peace." And the last slide really, and I've sort of made this up, as you can see, but it actually says that Jerusalem will be raised up like a mountain. There'll be a huge earthquake, it says. We read about it. And it says Jerusalem will get raised up, and a great beautiful temple will get built on top of this mountain. And it says that people will go flowing to it when Jesus gets back. And this is what the Bible actually says, better than I can say. This is Isaiah chapter 2. "In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of all, the most important place on earth." This is where Jerusalem, the mountain, when it talks about the Lord's house, that's the temple that was always in Jerusalem. So it will be the highest of all, the most important place on earth. It will be raised above the other hills, and people from all over the world will stream there to worship. People from many nations will say, "Come, let's go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob's God, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the Lord's teaching will go out from Zion, his word will go out from Jerusalem. The Lord will mediate between nations and will settle international disputes. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train for war anymore." Here's the key points that I think we've covered tonight. Jerusalem is now in the hands of the Jews, and they have sovereign control over it, and that is a sign that we're right at the end of it all. Jesus said we would live in an age of fear and distress just before he gets back, and that is where we are. Jerusalem will become the centre of worldwide conflict. That's the next thing on the agenda. And at some point soon, Jesus will return to intervene and set up a worldwide righteous government. So the future of Jerusalem will be a city of peace. And you might well ask the question, well, what's my involvement in all of this? How do I become part of this new government, this new wonderful kingdom that's going to be set upon this earth? I'm not covering that. There will be talks here that tell you exactly how you can play a part in that. Jerusalem, coming soon, it's going to be a city of trouble like we've never seen before, but it will conclude, and it will become a city of peace when Jesus himself comes back and establishes God's kingdom.